What if the greatest hero of aviation didn't vanish in a flash of fuel and fire, but was instead sentenced to a slow, agonizing death on a tropical paradise? What if we heard her last message, but were too slow to understand the terrible truth it contained? We left the story of Amelia Earhart at the edge of the abyss, swallowed by the cold logic of the crash and sink theory. That narrative demands a swift, violent end, a catastrophic plunge into the 20,000-foot crushing darkness of the Central Pacific. It is neat, final, and absolute. But for decades, a different, far more haunting whisper has persisted. A theory rooted in survival, desperation, and the cruel irony of a rescue that arrived just hours too late. This is the story of the Nikumaroro Theory, often called the Castaway Theory. It replaces the swift terror of a crash with the slow, psychological horror of abandonment. It posits that Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, did not crash and sink. Instead, they survived. They made a successful, desperate emergency landing on a remote, uninhabited coral atoll, and they spent their final agonizing weeks listening to the world look for them in the wrong place. The island at the center of this chilling theory is Nikumaroro, previously known as Gardner Island. It is a tiny crescent-shaped ring of sand and palm trees, approximately 350 nautical miles southeast of their intended target, Howland Island. It is the definition of a tropical paradise, lush, surrounded by turquoise water. And yet, it became the most brutal, beautiful prison on Earth. This theory is not the work of armchair fantasists. It is meticulously researched and championed by the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, TIGAR, a group that has dedicated decades and millions of dollars to archaeological expeditions on Nikumaroro. They believe that the most critical piece of evidence against the crash and sink theory came not from the ocean, but from the airwaves, after the plane was officially declared lost. Imagine the agonizing scene following the last, faint transmission from Earhart on the morning of July 3, 1937. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca and the entire search fleet believe the Lockheed Electra has run out of fuel and is sinking fast. They search the vast empty sea around Howland Island. They search the sky. They search the oil slicks that never appear. They conclude the plane has gone down. But the silence did not last. Over the next 5 nights, distress signals, faint and distorted, began to pierce the airwaves. They were heard by numerous operators across the Pacific, as far away as Texas and Florida, operating on the same frequency as Earhart's radio. These signals weren't the strong, clear voice of an aircraft in flight. They were the weak, intermittent, desperate pleas of an emergency radio running on battery power, powered by survivors. One message, reportedly logged by an operator in Leh, was devastatingly clear. A female voice identified herself, stated she was injured, and pleaded for help. Another message, heard by a young woman in Florida named Betty Klenk, was even more chilling. She claimed to have recorded a frantic call detailing a crash, rising water, and Noonan being injured. Although controversial, the sheer number of reports of post-loss signals suggests one undeniable truth. Someone was alive and transmitting. The Nikumaroro theory provides the answer to this radio riddle. It suggests that, running critically low on fuel and unable to locate Howland, Noonan, the brilliant navigator, sighted the coral outline of Nikumaroro. Against all odds, Earhart executed a flawless, wheels-up landing on the reef flat, a strip of hard coral exposed at low tide. The landing gear would have crumpled instantly, but the cockpit might have remained intact, allowing both pilot and navigator to escape the wreckage. They were alive. They had survived the flight. But the terrifying new reality was that they were 350 miles off course, and the plane, their lifeline, was slowly being consumed by the tides. The signals heard for days were their desperate attempt to contact the world using the Electra's limited battery power, fueled by hope. But the hope was a cruel mirage. Why didn't anyone find them? Because the official search focused solely on the vicinity of Howland Island. They searched the line 157, 337, believing the Electra had simply run out of fuel at the end of that line. Nikumaroro was far outside the accepted search grid. The horrifying tragedy of the near miss occurred just 3 days after the crash. On July 6th, the aircraft carrier USS Colorado launched a search plane that flew directly over Nikumaroro. The pilots reported signs of recent habitation clearly visible. A native hut, but no signals, no sign of wreckage. The pilot, Lieutenant John O. Lambrecht, misinterpreted the small, desperate camp as the remains of a deserted colonial settlement. Crucially, the tide was high when he flew over, completely obscuring the dark fuselage of the Electra resting on the reef flat. The aircraft, their massive, bright yellow signal, was hidden beneath the waves. They flew away. They dismissed the island. They abandoned the survivors just hours after seeing the smoke of their desperation. Earhart and Noonan watched their salvation fly away, deaf and blind to their plight. This is the moment the Castaway Theory shifts from a story of miraculous survival to an epic tragedy of isolation and slow, creeping death. The post-crash signals soon stopped. The plane's batteries died. The silence returned, this time absolute. And the world concluded that the sea had swallowed them whole. But the sea hadn't. The island had. And the island, indifferent and beautiful, kept its prisoners secret for decades. The real breakthrough in this theory came from the sustained archaeological efforts led by Tigar, who began sending expeditions to Nikumaroro in the late 1980s. What they found was not a smoking gun, not the plane itself, but something perhaps more chilling, undeniable evidence of an American castaway struggling for survival. The initial discoveries were tantalizing. Fragments of aluminum consistent with a Lockheed Electra panel, a piece of a distinct, 7-layered plexiglass window frame. These fragments, while small, suggested the plane had indeed come apart on the reef, scattering debris across the island's uninhabited landscape. Then came the domestic artifacts, whispering the story of a woman's desperate final days. Archaeologists found a distinct woman's shoe sole, a size 9 heel, consistent with Earhart's documented size and style. They found a jar of freckle cream, an item often used by women in the 1930s to lighten sunspots, and known to be used by Earhart to cover her sun-weathered skin. They found fragments of cosmetic jars and a small piece of a hand mirror. These were not the possessions of a typical male sailor or colonist. These were the intimate items of a modern, well-groomed American woman. Most compellingly, excavations revealed evidence of a rudimentary castaway camp near a rare cluster of trees on the island's southeast end. They found fire pits, remnants of slaughtered bird bones, and most chillingly, the remains of marine turtles that had been butchered and cooked. Classic signs of prolonged, desperate survival. The castaways were utilizing the limited resources of the atoll, but they were not thriving. The true cornerstone of the Nikumaroro theory, however, rests on a discovery made decades earlier, in 1940. A British colonial officer, Gerald Gallagher, searching the island, found partial skeletal remains, a skull, a jaw, and some limb bones, along with a makeshift grave, a bottle of Benedictine liqueur, and 2 old shoes. Gallagher shipped the bones to Fiji, where an amateur forensic examination was conducted by Dr. D.W. Hoodless. Hoodless, using the very rudimentary forensic methods available in 1941, concluded the bones belonged to a stocky, middle-aged European male. The findings were dismissed, and the bones were subsequently lost. The case seemed closed. But the story didn't end there. The Tigar group retrieved Hoodless's original measurement data. In 2018, renowned forensic anthropologist Dr. Richard Jantz from the University of Tennessee reanalyzed these measurements using modern computer programs and statistical techniques, comparing them to the known dimensions of Amelia Earhart, taken from her clothing size and photos. The results were stunning. Jantz concluded that the bones were more similar to Earhart than to 99% of individuals in a large reference sample. The initial conclusion of a stocky male was proven flawed. The bones were highly consistent with a tall, slender woman of Earhart's specific stature. This forensic reanalysis provides the most compelling, scientific link between Amelia Earhart and Nikumaroro Island. It transforms the archaeological discoveries from intriguing artifacts into the heartbreaking remnants of a desperate final stand. The Castaway Theory paints a horrifying picture of their final weeks. They were alive, but facing the brutal realities of a tropical castaway existence. Nikumaroro is harsh. Though it receives ample rain, the water quickly drains through the porous coral. Fresh water would have been a constant, agonizing problem. Food, initially plentiful with nesting birds and fish, would have dwindled under sustained hunting. The physical strain was immense, but the psychological torture was perhaps worse. They would have salvaged the Electra's battery, desperately rationing power, listening for the hopeful static of a rescue plane or ship. They heard the world searching, but slowly realized that their signals were too weak or too misunderstood. The plane itself, their only real shelter and their giant beacon, sat exposed on the reef flat. With each successive high tide, the ocean would have battered the aluminum shell, tearing away pieces, dragging the massive wreck further down the slope and into the ocean. Watching their last hope crumble and disappear beneath the waves must have been the ultimate surrender to fate. Their deaths would not have been instantaneous, but drawn out, the slow burn of dehydration, the ravages of tropical disease, or simply starvation. A prolonged, agonizing end on a beautiful, indifferent island, a fate utterly inconsistent with the public image of the heroic, daring adventurer. The Castaway Theory is terrifying because it forces us to confront the human vulnerability of the legend, the final, desperate struggle stripped of all glamour and glory. The true horror of the Nikumaroro Theory is not that Amelia Earhart vanished. It's that she survived the crash, only to be abandoned by the world she was trying to inspire. We return to the overarching mystery. The crash and sink theory relies on physics and failed navigation, concluding the end was swift and absolute. The Nikumaroro Theory relies on archaeology, forensic science, and misinterpreted radio waves, concluding the end was slow and agonizing. Which is the greater tragedy? The instant, violent death in the dark abyss, leaving no trace, or the prolonged, desperate suffering under the tropical sun, leaving behind a pathetic scattering of bones and personal effects, an indelible record of the struggle? The wreckage of the Lockheed Electra itself remains the elusive Holy Grail. Tigar continues to mount expensive, deep-sea sonar searches near the island, convinced that the plane's fuselage was dragged off the reef and lies down the slope, preserved in the cold depths. Finding the plane would definitively prove the Castaway Theory, but even without the metal, the narrative of Nikumaroro is compelling. The freckle cream, the shoe, the forensically reanalyzed bones, they paint a human picture, an intimate portrait of a woman's final, desperate stand against the forces of nature. Amelia Earhart's final words, whether screamed into the radio or whispered to the indifferent wind of Nikumaroro, remain unheard. The island holds the terrifying secret of their last, harrowing weeks. The final answer lies not just in finding the wreckage, but in accepting the chilling possibility that their heroism ended, not in glory, but in a desperate, lonely surrender on a remote, beautiful, and utterly cruel desert island. The echoes of Gardner Island continue to whisper the true, agonizing conclusion of the greatest mystery in aviation.